Now I'm going to install the power supply. I've got my ATX power supply right here. And these install very simply in most ATX cases by loading them in through the top, like so, sliding towards the rear, and then you simply get the 4 screws that secure the power supply to the case and screw them in. Got the screws right over here. Okay, once all of the screws are installed, now we can plug the power supply into the motherboard. This motherboard uses only the ATX main connector here, which is the 20-pin connector, and does not use the auxiliary or ATX 12-volt connector. So if you have the auxiliary or 12-volt connector, you'll simply leave those unattached and sort of hanging inside the case. I'm going to take my main power connector, locate the ATX power connector on the motherboard, and plug it in. There's little danger of doing this incorrectly because these connectors are keyed. Once that's plugged in, the power supply is now connected to the motherboard. The only thing that remains in this particular situation is this case uses a chassis-mounted fan which uses a disk drive connector to provide power. Some of them will use a connector that goes to the motherboard, and most motherboards have a chassis fan power tap. So in the case where yours plugs into the motherboard, then look for that connector on the board. In this case, this one will plug into one of the free disk drive connectors. So I'll simply find one here, and route it down through the case, and plug the chassis fan into that connector. And that pretty much completes the connection of power to the system. Of course, as we install drives and other things, we'll be connecting the power to those devices as well. Now that the motherboard is installed, we have an opportunity to do a little bit of power-on troubleshooting and testing. Now, one thing I wanted to caution everybody about is this system is ATX, which means it uses an ATX form factor motherboard and power supply. The ATX power supply is always on as long as it's plugged in, at least partially on. That's important to know. What that means is that as long as you're working on the system, installing or removing cards, you need to make sure that the power supply is unplugged. If this power supply is plugged in to the wall outlet and you install memory or other cards, you could potentially damage both the cards you're installing, the memory module, and also the motherboard, because these things can be powered up, at least partially, anytime the power supply is plugged in. So I've had the system unplugged. I've got the motherboard installed. I have no memory in the system right now. What I wanted to show is what will happen if you power on a PC with nothing plugged into it at all. All we have here is the processor installed. I've got no keyboard, no mouse, no video card, no cards of any kind, no memory even installed in the motherboard. I'm going to plug power in to the wall, and I'm going to turn the system on. Let's see what happens. And what we're hearing is a series of long beeps that continuously repeat. According to the documentation that came with this motherboard, that is in fact the error code for an award BIOS, which is what this has, where there's a failure in the first bank of memory, or no memory has been detected. So that's exactly the type of error message I was expecting. Now I'm going to turn the system off. If you just press the button once, you'll notice that it doesn't power off. ATX power supplies have a built-in override feature to allow power off if you hold the power button down for a number of seconds. So I'm going to press the power button and hold it down, and after a few seconds, the system should turn off. Now, another thing I was looking at while the system was running here, I wanted to verify the chassis fan and the CPU heatsink fan were both spinning, and they were. And I didn't hear any noises or grinding, which means there was no interference with the fan blades. So, if you have a system which doesn't appear to boot up, we call that a black screen problem. That is, you turn it on and nothing happens. One of the things I recommend is you completely strip all of the boards out of the system, disconnect the disk drives, and even remove all of the memory. Turn the system on. You should hear beeps similar to what we just heard. Now, different BIOS have different error codes as far as these power on beep codes are concerned. So you need to look in the documentation for your motherboard, or you can look in the back of my book. We've got the error codes listed for all of the major BIOS manufacturers, including Phoenix, Award, and AMI. Now that we've verified that the motherboard and processor are functional, I'd like to install at least the first bank of RAM and verify that that's functional also. Plus, you'll get to see the type of power on error code you'll see when we have a system that just has memory installed. Now, before I plug the memory in, I have to make sure, again, that this power supply is unplugged from the wall, being that this is an ATX design. That's very important. I have here a PC133 DIMM module, and I'm going to install it into the first DIMM socket on this motherboard. This happens to be 128 megabytes, but you can use pretty much any size you'd like. I recommend 128 meg as a minimum for most systems today. Now the module is fully seated. I can now plug the power in from the wall to the power supply, and I'm going to turn the system on, and let's see what we hear. Okay, that was 1 long and 3 short beeps. According to the award, or the information about the award BIOS, the diagnostic error codes, that indicates a video card failure, which of course is exactly what we expect to hear now because we have no video card installed. So it does verify that the memory is functioning. Otherwise, we would have heard that repeating long beep scenario that we had earlier. Now that we've verified that the motherboard, processor, and memory are functioning, we can continue by installing the video card, other cards, disk drives, etc.